Welcome to Manchester, especially to those members who've travelled from overseas, because I know there are some of you and I hope to meet you during the course of the next 2 days. Important housekeeping, there is no fire alarm planned, so apparently it's a recorded message that we hear, and at that point you would exit through the doors that you've come in through and out, down the stairs and out of the building, and there's a grassed area that you need to stand on. Hopefully that won't happen. Can I remind everybody please to turn their mobile phones to silent, and if you have a smartwatch or anything like that, also turn that to silent. I got caught out like that when I had it newly. So, great to be in Manchester again, the home of the AUA office. Welcome to the conference. Welcome to the opening session. First of all, and very importantly, I want to thank our sponsors, and particularly the sponsors for the plenary, who are Communications Management, and we are delighted to have the MD, Justin Shaw, here. Justin, if you could stand up and wave so people recognise you. This is important because Communications Management has just published a report on how universities go about producing their strategies, and that's very important to us all. And they will be really pleased to see you. Justin's got a copy of the report with him. He will be at the Meet the Networks area, and I'm really not going to call it the Garden of Delights, but there may be a competition later in the conference for new names for that lovely little area at the front with the picket fence, which is very decorative, and where you'll meet the networks and the trustees at various points during the conference. So please engage in that area. Our theme for the conference is transformations. I don't need to tell anybody that we're living at a time of profound change, both within our sector and more widely in the world. And the question that we're setting ourselves is how we transform ourselves and how we help to transform our institutions to meet the challenges that we're all facing. Therefore, it is an enormous honour to have Nicola Dandrige, the CEO of Universities UK, as our opening plenary speaker. There probably is nobody who knows much more than Nicola does about the challenges that we're facing and some of the ways that we may be addressing them. She's been Chief Executive of Universities UK since September 2009. Universities UK, as you'll all know, is the representative organisation for the UK's universities. It was founded in 1918, has 135 members and offices in London, Cardiff, and importantly for me, in Edinburgh. Its mission is to be the definitive voice of all universities in the UK, promoting the strength and success of UK universities nationally and internationally. Nicola was previously Chief Executive of the Equality Challenge Unit, another very important institution, which, as you know, promotes diversity and equality for staff and students. Prior to this, Nicola was a lawyer, and we're not going to hold that against her. But I am really delighted to welcome Nicola and to ask her to give our opening plenary and get the conference off to a fantastic start.
Thank you very much, and thank you so much to the AUA for inviting me to contribute to your conference today. I'm going to talk about politics, change and opportunity. That's a rather highfalutin title for this presentation. Having said that, I do want to touch on some of the many issues relevant to the theme of your conference that are impacting on higher education at the moment. The change is enormous, the opportunities are huge, the challenges are significant, and a lot of this is driven by politics with both a big P and a little p. And I'm going to touch on some of the themes that I think are most relevant to all our work within the higher education sector. Particularly focusing on the UK and to some extent on England in particular, simply because that does, I understand, represent the majority of you who are here today, but also because the change in England is so very significant. But as we know, what's happening in England certainly impacts on the whole of the United Kingdom, so I hope this will have relevance to all of you. The European Universities Association, the representative body for many universities in Europe, as its name suggests, has just published what they call the autonomy scorecard, which monitors the extent to which universities in Europe are autonomous or not on a complex scorecard scale. And it shows that many institutions in Europe are seeing reductions in their autonomy, whether that's through ties to funding, state control or influence over staffing decisions, over organisational decisions, over academic decisions. And so we see quite a few countries, Hungary, Estonia, France, Republic of Ireland, either in a low-ish position or reducing in terms of their autonomy. And yet, once again, we also see the United Kingdom coming out at top in terms of the autonomy of its institutions by reference to organisational independence and staffing and financial controls. And many of you will be aware that there is extensive research that has been done in Europe and in the UK which correlates that autonomy to the success of the sector. It's something that's therefore very important, I think, to our universities and something we care about very deeply. But I've always worried about this idea of autonomy and how to present and articulate it. Because on the one hand, we know that it's enormously important in the way that universities are run. On the other hand, it's really difficult, I think, to express it in a way that doesn't sound unbelievably pompous. It's a really awkward word, autonomy. It doesn't play well in the media. It's just a tricky concept to express, and it's perhaps smacks of elitism, a sense of universities just being left alone to do what they want to do in a way that's not answerable, and it's got potentially all those overtones. But, and this is a big but, that of course is not really what it's about. What is meant at its best by autonomy is an ability by universities to devise and implement their own strategies, to have the freedom to respond effectively and flexibly to their particular local or regional circumstances, their own strategy, the industry needs of the employers and industry they work with, to respond to their particular specialist focus and their strengths, to student demand, and so on and so forth. In a way, I guess it's tied to what we at UK describe as the diversity of the sector, and it's something which we promote whenever we can. So thinking about the challenges, the opportunities, the changes that we're witnessing at the moment in the higher education sector, I was reflecting that actually this thread of autonomy and the importance of autonomy is something that runs throughout many of the points that I'm going to make this morning. Certainly in the context of the Higher Education and Research Bill, it accounts for a lot of the amendments that we've been pushing for to ensure that institutional autonomy is protected. It's certainly influenced our response to the Teaching Excellence Framework. It's absolutely essential in responding to volatility in student demand and employer needs. And it relates in many ways to our ability to respond to the challenges of Brexit. And in thinking about the increasing devolution, if not potentially independence, that we may be witnessing within the United Kingdom and the different nations within the UK, certainly autonomy is a common value that is shared across the UK, whatever individual decisions nations may take. So I'm going to touch on some of the changes facing us, as I've said, but you'll see how this theme of autonomy is absolutely critical and central, and is an issue I'm going to return to in terms of how we can respond effectively. So this is what I'm going to touch on. I'm afraid because the scale of what I could talk about is so huge, I'm going to be speaking very cursorily and concisely in some of these areas. In other words, I'm going to be skimming over them rather quickly in a way that doesn't really do justice to the significance of them, but don't really have time to do anything other. So I'm going to touch on students' immigration, research and industrial strategy, the bill and TEF Brexit, and then finish with emerging responses, threats and opportunities before trying to draw some conclusions. So, moving on rapidly, I wanted to start with students because the student volatility is something which is determining institutional shape, size, response to a quite considerable degree. And even though often in the media and at UK we talk in aggregate level about changes in student numbers, at institutional level the picture can look very different, with some institutions seeing increases in student numbers, others seeing quite significant decreases, and that obviously requires different sorts of responses. We now have 43% of young people at university, with this marked imbalance between men and women, which I think at the moment is not a cause for immediate alarm, but I think it flags a trend that needs to be watched very carefully to ensure that young men are not becoming increasingly disengaged from education. The statistic which I think is the starkest and remains the most worrying is that distinction between participation by disadvantage and disadvantaged groups. These are the polar categorizations of socioeconomic status. So 52% of the most privileged go to university, 13.6% of the least go to university. This is still a real imbalance that has to be a real priority for all of us, and I'm going to come back to that. We see increasing numbers of students going through clearing. It's not really clearing anymore, it's just an alternative, totally acceptable and widespread mechanism of getting into university. A significant drop in mature students. This is the 2016 end of cycle report, and that's replicated in the 2017 figures. And then this increase in unconditional offers, which I just think is very interesting, really. It's an example, I think, of institutional strategies responding to changes in student numbers. These are two charts just graphically illustrating the trends in terms of participation figures. I'm not going to spend very long on that, other than noting that there is a downward shift. This is applications, I should say, not enrolments, and so some of that can be remedied in the way that the enrolments work their way through. I will come back to some of these issues because I think it flags a potential vulnerability. And we see there on the right-hand side that in the orange line, that's EU figures, that they are going down. That chart takes us up to 2017, and that is in part, we think, a reflection of and a response to Brexit. These are the latest application figures for March 2017, which shows this downward trend in applicants by 4% across the whole of the UK. Interestingly, young people are stable, 18-year-old young applicants are stable. It's the mature students that we see falling, with the biggest drop in terms of subjects allied to medicine, which is closely, which includes nursing, incidentally, and that's closely correlated with mature students, and also a number of humanities subjects going down. History's down, philosophy's down, alarmingly foreign languages down, which was already from a very low base. And then some of the more perhaps vocational subjects are going up. Maths, architecture, law, and so on, we're seeing increases. And I think to some extent that must reflect this, what we know to be a growing appetite amongst students to study subjects which they believe are going to lead them to jobs. Mind you, I mean, modern foreign languages are likely to lead to jobs, so there's something else going on there, possibly related to how these subjects are taught in school. But I think what that does show is some volatility. I mean, interestingly, for the fall in nursing and subjects allied to medicine and mature students. Part of that, potentially, is due to the fact that even though applications are going down, the enrolments may remain reasonably stable. We don't know yet, but that looks as if that may be the case. But also, I think there's an issue with mature students potentially choosing to study in different ways, maybe online, maybe in alternative providers, because these are the UCAS figures. So it may not be all bad, but I think there is a sense in which older people may be choosing not to upskill, in which case that is very worrying, and it's something that I think we do need to keep an eye on. I'll come back to at the end of this presentation. This is the graphic illustration of the difference in participation from different groups, socioeconomic status groups, with group 1, the purple line at the bottom, being the most disadvantaged and the green being the most advantaged. And although the participation rates from the most advantaged is going up, you can see that the gap is remaining pretty stubborn. And I think that has to be a real concern as in our post-Brexit world where there are real challenges in terms of social cohesion. This is a very obvious illustration of where the differences lie. I think also from a purely commercial perspective, if you're looking at where the market lies, arguably the most disadvantaged now, and so many people are going to university that possibly there's not much room for expansion there. But if you look at where there is a market and increased participation, it's in the lower socioeconomic groups. So I think from universities who are wanting to expand their numbers, then that's probably where they need to focus. It's not just a question of socioeconomic status. I think these slides, I'm going to show you a couple of slides which show participation by racial groups. I think these have to be treated with real care, actually, and there is a danger about stereotyping by invoking statistics. But nonetheless, they are telling us something important, I think. You may not be able to read the codes on the right, but these are entry rates, so it's proportionate to the size of the population of the groups. And what it shows is very high participation by groups who identify as Chinese. And the bottom line, the green line, is the white group, so it's students who are white. And this perhaps reinforces some of our concerns about the social dislocation that we see in the country and the greatest disengagement, not being minority groups, traditionally so-called, but disengaged white working class, particularly boys. And I think as we think about our responsibilities in relation to social cohesion, they have to focus on that group because they are the lowest participation. I mean, interestingly, it's slightly different if you look at high tariff providers. So these are those universities who have higher entry requirements to get in, where again we see this extraordinarily high proportionate representation from Chinese groups. And here there's a bunch of groups at the bottom, but the lowest group there is black. So there's something that's going on there in terms of participation between different types of universities as well. But white very much firmly in the bottom for that group as well. I'm going to move rather rapidly on to immigration now, because this is such a challenge for many universities. And we are very at the influence of external factors here, the influence of positive factors such as the global demand for increased higher education and increasing mobility of international students. But also we are we're exposed to the politics of immigration in this country, which we believe has had an impact on some of these figures. These show figures up to 2015, so it's an old slide, but it's a good illustration of trends. And it shows, for instance, the United States, which is the blue line at the top, rapidly growing participation by international students, with the orange line. And it shows that there was a steady increase up to about 2012, and then it's pretty much stagnated. And in fact, post-2015, which is the last year of this slide, the numbers are starting to decline. These are overall numbers of international students. The next slide is enrollments. And in a way, this is more indicative of the future. And if you look at the bottom, it's the UK number of new international student entrance, and it shows a real flatlining there between 2010, 11 and 14, 15. This, I think, is despite the fact that universities are trying to grow, in large part, international student numbers, certainly grow their diversity as well. And I think it's a real challenge. And one of the reasons, I think, for this flatlining, apart from the internal politics of immigration, is what other countries are doing. You probably can't read this, but it's a sort of illustrative chart showing how other countries are actively investing in strategies to increase international student numbers across the piece. And so, I mean, we won't go through all of these, but many of these, China target to double the number of international students. France, post-study work opportunities are expanding. Canada, increasing government investment in marketing, and so on and so forth. So one of the reasons as well that numbers here for UK institutions are flatlining is because of what other countries are doing. And I think this is an important lesson as we're looking at how universities are positioning themselves and engaging with the wider political environment. It's not as if the rest of the world is standing still. On the contrary, there's a real investment, I think, in expansion and investing in higher education, certainly investing in research capacity as well. And so when we look at what we're doing in the UK, it has to be tested and viewed in the context of what other countries are doing. And it's a very significant investment in their recruitment of international students, which I think has to be a real challenge for us. I mentioned domestic immigration policy, and it's been a right old mix, really, of different messages and opinions. I think it reached a low point in October last year where the Home Secretary announced a consultation on steps needed to control immigration and whether student immigration rules should be tailored to the quality of the course and the quality of the educational institution. This was something that we were very concerned about. We couldn't see how the Home Office could start judging what was the quality of the educational institution. To some extent, I think, however, this was an immediate response to Brexit, and although these issues haven't gone away, that consultation hasn't been forthcoming. And what we're now seeing is, in the face of those various challenges that I've listed on that slide, not least political opposition, lack of data on student exit, and so on and so forth, we're seeing a different tone now coming out of government, and in particular the recent announcement of a review of immigration policy post-Brexit. And it may be that some of these issues are going to be captured within that policy, and we are seeking to have a thoughtful and evidence-based engagement with government about these sorts of things. We do also have the Higher Education and Research Bill going through Parliament at the moment, and that certainly flags the issue of immigration. One of the amendments concerns international students, and we don't know where that's going to end up. So this is a very volatile and fast-moving area. I'm going to move on very quickly to touch on public investment in science and research. Historically, the UK has invested very little in R&D. We have invested about 1.8% of our GDP in research and development compared to an OECD average of 2.3%. Very much lower, and you can see from this chart it's been a low for a long time, which makes our performance in terms of research all the more remarkable in many respects. The government has, you'll remember from the autumn statement, announced a £4.7 billion investment in research and development, an astonishingly substantial investment, and that probably will bring us up to about 2%, just under 2%. So it is a fantastic opportunity. It's something I want to come back to in terms of what the opportunities are for universities. But that is against a backdrop of low public investment. And I think that does create real challenges for us in terms of international competition, where other countries are just piling money in to their universities as a way of either regenerating or maintaining economic success and effective productivity. But this is where we're heading on the R&D investment. It's the Industrial Strategy Green Paper, which is still up for consultation, so we don't quite know where it's going to end up. But in terms of opportunities for universities, they are significant. The Green Paper maps out 10 pillars which the government believes are important to build a modern industrial strategy. That's how it describes it. And of these 10 pillars, arguably all of them, but certainly most of them, allow for a very significant contribution by universities. I mean, the first one, investing in science, research and innovation, is obvious, but look at some of the others. Developing skills, driving growth across the whole country. I mean, what a wonderful ability universities have to drive growth within their own regions or localities. Creating the right institutions to bring together sectors and places. Well, we are, in many respects, the major anchor institution in our locality, encouraging trade and inward investment, hugely relevant to universities, supporting businesses, delivering affordable energy and clean growth, and so on and so forth. So here we have an industrial strategy which is out for consultation with money behind it, which is almost handing opportunities to universities on a plate. Not just universities, of course, business and research institutes as well. But I think there's everything to be seized in terms of playing into that industrial strategy and playing to our strengths. I've mentioned the bill on a couple of occasions. This is a major piece of legislation that's going to affect the way that universities operate. And we've been very involved at UK in responding to consultations, in lobbying, in discussing, in trying to make best sense of this. As I said at the beginning, it is primarily, they're not uniquely focused on England, but the impact of what's happening here will certainly have real relevance across the whole of the United Kingdom. I think the most significant aspect of this is this creation of the OFS, the Office for Students to Promote Competition. So this replaces our funding council, HEFCE, and it means that we no longer have a funding council, a buffer body, whose primary focus was arguably to look after the interests of universities and oversee them in terms of what they do. That is now shifting entirely. We no longer have a buffer body. Instead, we have a regulator which is going to be focusing on students and competition. And I think this means that universities are going to have to take even more responsibility in England for their own futures, which again, I guess, enhances their autonomy, but also increases the risks that they face. So we have new powers in the Office for Students. There is some continuity in terms of what HEFCE does, but it's a different body altogether. And then conversely, we've got the arrival of the UK Research and Innovation, UKRI, which is going to take responsibility for all aspects of dual support in terms of the research funding and oversight. Very different sort of picture of governance and regulation in the UK. Amendments announced in February to the bill are very significant. This is the one that government amendments announced to encourage the use of accelerated degrees and credit transfer. But autonomy was a really important part of it. This was something that we lobbied on. This is the OFS, will need to have regard to the need to protect institutional autonomy. And this is a clause that reads across the whole bill and extremely important. Standards, again, there was a bit of an arcane discussion about this, but we were very keen that they shouldn't be owned by government, but instead it should respect the sector's responsibility for standards. The teaching excellence framework has caused a lot of debate, as you know. You'll probably be familiar with all of this. This is just a slide which sets out the basic metrics of the teaching excellence framework. We do broadly support this, but are concerned that it shouldn't drive a sort of it shouldn't drive down to sort of common standardization of teaching. And I think making sure that the TEF works to protect the diversity of institutions is going to be really critical. Again, important amendments were announced in February with a commitment by government to review the TEF, importantly, how the metrics are used, what the relationship is between metrics and qualitative evidence, and even the number and names of ratings. So you know at the moment it's proposed there's just gold, silver and bronze, and there's been some concern about whether that's going to send out a sufficiently nuanced message about the quality and diversity of higher education teaching, but that will be reviewed as well, and a review also of subject level the TEF, which is being proposed. The pilot's being extended. And I think that's very welcome because there are real concerns about how subject-level TEF can be made to work. I'm going to move on quickly now to very different political territory. It's interesting this because on the face of it, there's no need for universities to be close to politics, whether with a big P or a little p. We should just get on and do what we do, teaching, research, industry engagement, all the rest of it. But in practice, there is a very close relationship, and we are very affected, over-affected, I think, by political decisions, and perhaps more so than ever before. It's not that politicians are particularly interested in higher education, though some of them are. It's more that their decisions impact on what we do. And I mean, Brexit is the most obvious example, where the Brexit decision didn't really have much to do with universities, but my goodness, the impact is going to be very considerable. So what does Brexit mean, moving on to that issue? Well, what we do know is we're going to be leaving in March 2019. There's going to be an end to free movement, though we don't quite know when or how. Government is committed to minimise turbulence and maximise opportunities, which is something we should be making the most of. And what we don't know, though, is how Europe's going to respond to this. That's in suspended animation in large part, pending the results of the French and German elections. We don't know the government's priorities for exit, and that's a real challenge. We probably won't know them until the end of the 2-year negotiated period. We don't know what the long-term economic impact is, and we don't know what the impact of our leaving will be on Europe. So huge numbers of uncertainties, and no one can answer these questions. And therefore, our response has to be extremely flexible to take into account all sorts of different outcomes. Major challenges, I mean, particularly I think in terms of staff, this is providing reassurance to EU staff who are absolutely critical to the operation of universities. How can we make sure that they don't feel vulnerable, that they're wanted, that we retain them within our universities, but also in the future that we can carry on recruiting international staff, both professional and academic. Challenges to recruiting European students, challenges to research collaboration, funding, and mobility for both staff and students. We at UK have identified 3 categories of challenge that we were taking forward. The first is the immediate priorities, which is about EU students and staff. Those are the 2 bullets at the bottom of the page. But then I think these slides will be available, by the way, because I'm skipping over them very quickly. Then there's a whole bunch of considerations in relation to exit negotiations. We are pushing to have access to and influence over, it's called FP9, Framework Programme 9, which is the research funding programme that follows on from the current one. We want continued participation in the Erasmus Mobility Programme and recognition of qualifications. But of course, it's not just what we want from Europe. There are also significant domestic developments that we're pushing for, not least a reformed immigration system, and also enhanced support for international research collaborations, because we simply don't know what's going to happen in relation to European research, and so we want investment in independent, domestically driven international research. There are positive signs, I think. The white paper, the Brexit white paper contained numerous references to universities and the need to protect them. And you may have seen that some of these were picked up in the Article 50 letter that the Prime Minister signed. And for those of you from Northern Ireland, if there are some of you, we have 2 members in Northern Ireland, Ulster and Queen's, and they're extremely concerned about the common travel area in relation to the Republic, and that was picked up in the Article 50 letter to show that government is going to try and seek to maintain the common travel area, so critical to the success and sustainability of Northern Irish institutions. So I think there's some very positive signals, but it is very early stages, and I think most difficult is the fact that we really don't know where all this is going to end up, so we're having to manage uncertainty. I was going to talk about technology and the digital revolution, which is terribly important, but time is not going to allow me, so I'm going to move on rather quickly. But it might be worth noting that changes to digital technology won't necessarily affect the sort of core model of what universities are and what they do, but my goodness, it will certainly affect how teaching and research are delivered, and how we engage with employers, how we engage on outreach programs, both domestically and internationally. This is a huge agenda, and it's changing very rapidly, and ultimately may have even more longer-term impacts than some of the political developments that I've talked about. I was also going to touch on free speech, because I think it is very relevant to autonomy. There are all sorts of drivers here in terms of the statutory requirement to secure free speech, duty to promote equality of opportunity. We've then got the whole prevent agenda, which to some extent constrains free speech when it's potentially give rise to the risk of drawing people into terrorism. We had a whole debate about Israel and definition of anti-Semitism. I put that on the slide because it's very relevant and pertinent. We've thought about that a lot within the UK, how universities can navigate their way through speakers who are critical of Israel. And then there's the whole safe spaces and trigger warnings debate, largely driven by student unions, which has the potential to constrain free speech, or depending on what side you are, allow for open discussion about issues in a sensitive environment. So you put all that together, and it's quite a contested field. And I think the danger for us is that we end up on the wrong side of the debate about free speech, because it is so critical to the success of universities that there can be completely open debate, discussion and learning. And I think this is a very contested field. And I'm not saying this is a #1 priority, but nonetheless, I think it's one of these things we've always got to be sensitive to and mindful of the implications. So I'm going to draw all this to some sort of conclusion. There are undoubted difficulties and constraints here. I've touched on some of the major ones, but if you think about the scope of what it is I've been talking about, from new legislation to Brexit to student demand and so on, I mean, this is an extraordinarily challenging environment. And I think the difficulty is, I hear this a lot from Vice-Chancellors, they can deal with any one or two quite comfortably. It's the fact it's all coming together at the same time. It's a very volatile environment, and I think there's a difficult perception of universities and all of this, that we're not necessarily on the front foot on free speech. There's allegations of left-wing bias. The politics are difficult in terms of immigration. We're up against some quite well-funded global competition. And then there's the longer-term disruptions from technology, together with financial pressures and huge pressures on governing bodies, particularly as HEFCE morphs into Office for Students and our BOFA body goes. So this is not an easy environment, but of course there are huge opportunities here that universities need to can navigate through and take advantage of. Universities, in many respects, are the antidote to Brexit. They can drive regional economic growth, can connect us internationally and respond to local needs, and certainly at the heart of many aspects of the industrial strategy. Social cohesion is a big issue, particularly flagged post-Brexit, but has been a problem within the UK for many years, and universities have a huge role there in terms of reaching out to disengaged communities. International development is another area where universities are increasingly playing a critical role. And through all of this, they display extraordinary capacity for flexibility and innovation. And there is something quite remarkable that everything's changing so rapidly, and yet there is a sort of stability. It sometimes feels as if universities are the only stable part of civic society at the moment. And so if there is to be a body or a sector which can reach out and address some of these many challenges, it's hard not to think that it's university. But to go back to my theme, to realise these opportunities and to their maximum, it really does require a flexibility by institutions. They do need to be agile, innovative, confident, and you can only do that if you are acting as an autonomous institution. And if you're constrained, or if, most importantly, if universities perceived themselves to be constrained, then their ability to respond is probably reduced. And this question of confidence and agility and flexibility and innovation, this doesn't just sit with vice-chancellors, it doesn't sit with the senior management teams. To be effective, it has to extend across the whole institutions, which is where I think it's so important that AUA members are engaged in these sorts of issues. If I look at the successful institutions within this country, they're the ones where you sense there's a whole institutional response to these particular challenges. And where that's not the case, then it's extraordinarily difficult for institutions to respond effectively, not least because you are the ones who are delivering many of the functions which really do and are going to make the difference to these challenges. And I think this question of understanding the external environment is critical not just for senior teams, but for the whole organisation, because it is, as I said, going to require the whole institution to adapt and respond in order to be effective. So with that, I was very pleased to be invited today to talk about some of these rather high-level issues, but that's the context in which decisions are being made, and it's the context in which decisions which affect everyone within the university are having to respond to. So very happy to answer questions, and I do wish you well with your conference, the theme of which is transformation, which seems to me so entirely appropriate given this environment that we're in at the moment. So thank you very much.
Well, the applause, I think, said it all, Nicola. The Twitter feed has gone mad. I've been watching it from here, so I don't need to tell you what the Twitter hashtag is. Thank you for engaging through the Twitter feed. There are roving mics appearing even as I speak, so in the usual way, could you please raise your hand, because Nicola has very kindly said she'll take some questions. Andrew West there.
Hello, Andrew West from the University of Sheffield. Thank you, Nicola, for a very comprehensive presentation. I feel quite tired, actually, after all of that. But I wondered if you might just say a word or two more to develop the last point you made, actually, about the contribution of professional services staff in the context of all of this change and challenge and opportunity, and where perhaps particularly we would be well placed to put our focus in the coming months and years.
That's a very good question. I slightly ducked it, apart from acknowledging that everyone has a role to play, because you do so many different things that it's quite difficult to generalise. I would answer it in this way. There are so many uncertainties at the moment that the only way in which universities can confidently go forward is by knowing that they've got the agility to respond. So they don't quite know what's going to happen in terms of student numbers. They don't quite know what's going to happen in terms of responding to employer needs. They don't quite know what's going to happen in terms of international students or international research collaboration and European funding. So there's this whole range of uncertainties. And I think the only way one can deal with that is to have the confidence to know that the institution can be flexible to respond to whatever it is that happens. And I think that's where it really ties into the work that you're doing, that if there is a sense in which, and I'm not for a second suggesting this is the case, but if there's a sense in which you do job X and you're going to carry on doing job X in exactly the way you always have, then that's simply going to fail this extraordinarily volatile environment. And so, in a way, this is not terribly comforting, because I think it does involve an acknowledgement that things are going to have to change and be flexible, and that's going to have to be part of all of our jobs. On the other hand, it's kind of quite exciting, really, to think that we have the capacity and the confidence to change how we do things to respond to this environment. So I think it's that whole question of change that I think, and being open about it and being up for it, that's possibly the only way I can intelligently answer your question, because I can't really say, well, it's going to mean X for you, because we don't know. I'm interested that the theme of your conference is transformation, because it seems to me that's really everyone's agenda at the moment. It has to be.
Matthew Andrews from the University of Gloucestershire. I wanted to pick up on your comment about universities being a point of stability within broader civic society. It sometimes seems that there is multiple narratives around higher education, and one of the more negative aspects is that universities can be viewed as elitist, with fat cat vice-chancellors leading populations of snowflake students and so on, which makes universities seem places of increasing isolation. I'm wondering if against that narrative you feel there is more that universities can or should be doing to engage perhaps as civic leaders of local societies.
Yeah, a very good question, a very topical question as well. I think there's two ways of answering that. One is the reality and the other is the perception. Because the reality is universities are extremely engaged in their locality, and anyone who thinks they aren't, and many people are of that view, probably are drawing conclusions from their own higher education experience that took place 30 or 40 years ago, or they don't want to know, or they're just unaware. Because the reality is that universities are really responsive to localities and regions, to greater and lesser extents, depending on institutional missions. But I have yet to be around a university and not been overwhelmed and profoundly impressed by the extent to which they're engaged in their communities, and a real sense of, I can't think what the noun is from porous, but a real sense that they are porous into their communities with flows either way. Clearly, there's a huge amount more to be done, and there's a lack of engagement in certain geographical areas, certain employers, so much more to be done. But nonetheless, I think that engagement is a really important part of what it is that they do. I think the problem, without being complacent about what we're doing, but I think the problem is primarily how we've chosen to communicate what it is that universities do. And I think in focusing so much on international research collaborations and international students, the narrative has tended to ignore that regional and local engagement. And there's almost been a sense in which we have to prove ourselves as national players to earn credibility. And that's undermined the importance of that regional and local engagement. So I think there's a huge challenge for us to better articulate what our local and regional engagement is, because it is absolutely fantastic in so many respects. That's not, though, to make any concessions on this whole expert issue, because if universities lose a sense of expertise and evidence-based expertise being important, then we've really lost what it is we're about. So I think we need to think, and I include the UK in this, I think we need to think much more about how we're presenting what it is that universities do, communicate much more through regional and local media, and really play up that engagement at local and regional level, and play out what we're doing in terms of outreach. I mean, my final comment on that, it's a huge issue, and I think it's completely fascinating, so I'm glad you've asked it. But if you remember that slide about participation rates, I mean, it's really difficult for us to say we are totally engaged with all parts of our community when participation is so diverse. Of course, that's not entirely our fault. It's largely to do with not uniquely our fault at all. It's to do with what's happening in schools, it's to do with stratification of society and so on and so forth. But nonetheless, if we end up in a position where it's more privileged students who end up at university and the least privileged who don't, then we're not going to win this argument. And so I think a lot of what we need to do, apart from getting our narrative better, is to really engage in those issues of social mobility and participation. I haven't done justice to a fantastic question, but you can see the gist of what I'm getting at.
Next question. Please wave vigorously. Oh, no, don't rhyme. Keep popping your hands up.
John Ryan. The HE bill, we hear a lot about competition, marketisation, but do you think there is an underlying motive which is a threat to the autonomy of universities?
An underlying
motive in the legislation. Is that what the HE bill is about? Office for Students, greater control over universities. Do you think it is fundamentally a threat to the autonomy which you've praised so greatly?
No, I don't actually. I mean, it's a really interesting question because there's so many different ways of answering that, and I'm trying to think of a way I can answer it concisely. But I think fundamentally the answer is no, because actually what the bill is doing is deregulating and to some extent, therefore, is creating greater autonomy for institutions. Where I think it's challenging, I think the TEF is very challenging, because that potentially drives, as I said, towards uniformity, and could, if it was handled badly and developed badly, end up with much greater government control through the use of metrics. So I think that's why we have to really focus on getting the TEF right. But I think the bill itself, no, I don't think so, because actually it is part of a deregulatory set of policies which, if anything, are allowing for greater autonomy, not less. But I say that with some caution, because there's aspects of it, I mean, not least the issue about standards and quality, which could go in the other direction. So I think we need to be really alert to how this pans out, and I think we've got to be absolutely on our mettle in terms of the next few years to make sure it doesn't have that impact. But I don't think there's anything intrinsic on the face of it which undermines institutional autonomy. And indeed, if you look at other countries, I mean, I started off with reference to the European scorecard, because other countries that are much more state-controlled, so moving in very much the opposite direction to this deregulatory environment, they undoubtedly have less autonomy. So I think it's up to us to make sure it doesn't have that impact, basically. But again, it's a good question to a really complex set of issues, and I haven't done it justice, because I think there's all sorts of areas where we need to be extremely mindful.
Thank you. I'm going to have to close the question session. Sorry, those who've got their hands up and I haven't managed to ask them, but we're going to move on to our next part of this session. Can I ask you to thank Nicola? I think it was an excellent note to finish on, that the future is very much in our hands. It can be bright, and we can make it that way. And can we thank Nicola for sharing so much with us? Excellent.